Hey everyone, welcome back. We are diving into some seriously choppy waters today. With this deep dive, we're tackling the political drama unfolding in South Korea. And trust me, it's a real nail biter.
Definitely keeping people on edge.
No kidding. We're talking about President Yoon Suk Yeol and his decision to declare martial law, and then just hours later completely reversing it.
Yeah.
It's a move that has the whole world scratching its head trying to figure out what on earth is going on.
It's a pretty unprecedented move for sure.
So to help us all make sense of this, we've got a mountain of news articles, expert opinions to dig through. We're going to break down how we got here, what it all means for South Korea, its allies, and the global ripple effects. This is a big one, folks.
It is.
Okay, so let's jump right in. Yoon's martial law declaration. I mean, it's not exactly something you see every day in a democracy, is it?
No, not at all. It's actually completely unprecedented in South Korea's modern history. Yoon's reasoning, he was trying to quell what he called anti-state forces that he claimed were trying to undermine the country's democracy.
Right.
But it's safe to say the justification didn't exactly land well.
Yeah, it seems like it backfired pretty spectacularly, didn't it?
It did. Almost immediately, protests broke out in Seoul. Calls for Yoon's resignation started flooding social media. The pressure just kept mounting.
I bet.
And he was forced to walk it back pretty quickly.
This has got to be sending shockwaves through the Biden administration. I mean, South Korea is a key ally in the region, and nearly 30,000 U.S. troops stationed there. And it's not just about regional stability. It's about maintaining that fight tonight readiness, especially with North Korea right there on their doorstep.
Absolutely. Any cracks in the U.S.-South Korea alliance could embolden North Korea and potentially disrupt the U.S.-Japan-South Korea partnership that Biden has worked hard to cultivate. A united front against China's influence is suddenly looking a lot less united.
So what's the vibe in D.C.? Controlled panic, or are they downplaying it?
Officially, it's all sighs of relief over Yoon's reversal, with the usual talking points about democracy being the foundation of the alliance. But behind the scenes, you can bet there's a lot of head-scratching and scrambling to understand what triggered this drastic move and how to contain the fallout.
This wasn't on anyone's 2024 bingo card, I'd imagine.
Not at all.
While Washington is trying to project an air of calm, there are other players in the region who are watching this whole thing unfold with a lot of interest. And I'm talking about North Korea, China, Russia. I doubt they're expressing much relief over this.
I wouldn't think so. This kind of instability in a key U.S. ally, it's got to be music to their ears.
Especially for Kim Jong-un. He's got a knack for turning chaos into opportunity. Remember that ICBM test right before the last U.S. election? The guy's a master of strategic timing.
Oh, absolutely. North Korea thrives on uncertainty. They could easily use this turmoil as cover for all sorts of mischief.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Imagine a surprise missile test near disputed waters, forcing Yoon into a strong response, further alienating him from his own people. Or they could launch cyber attacks on South Korean infrastructure, adding to the chaos and undermining confidence in Yoon's leadership.
So we've got a weakened South Korean president dealing with internal turmoil, a North Korean leader with a history of exploiting these situations, and a U.S. administration trying to keep a lid on things, all while facing their own election year pressures. Talk about a powder keg.
It's a perfect storm, for sure. And the big question is this just a temporary blip, or are we witnessing a fundamental shift in the regional power dynamics?
Okay, before we go there, let's unpack how Yoon's policies differ from his predecessors. We know he's taken a much tougher stance towards North Korea and hasn't been shy about supporting Ukraine. Has that contributed to this pressure cooker?
Absolutely. His tougher line on North Korea, it's not just talk. He's boosting South Korea's military, pushing for deeper security cooperation with the U.S., particularly on nuclear deterrence. That's a big departure from previous administrations. It's put both North Korea and China on edge.
So he's not just talking the talk, he's walking the walk. And that makes him a much less predictable and therefore more dangerous adversary in their eyes. No wonder they're enjoying watching him squirm.
Exactly. A divided and distracted South Korea is much easier to manipulate than a unified and assertive one. And this instability plays right into their goal of weakening U.S. influence in the region.
Okay, let's play out a worst-case scenario here. What if this whole thing implodes and Yoon gets kicked to the curb? What kind of fallout are we talking about?
That would introduce a whole new level of uncertainty. A new administration would face the same challenges, but they'd also inherit the legacy of Yoon's actions and a public deeply divided over his policies.
Not to mention this is all happening as we head into a U.S. presidential election. Imagine a new South Korean president taking office just as a new U.S. administration is finding its feet. Talk about a recipe for chaos.
Absolutely. You'd have both sides trying to figure each other out, establish new working relationships, assess each other's priorities, and there's no guarantee their approaches would align. A new U.S. president might not be on board with Yoon's hardline stance on North Korea, or they might hesitate to continue the same level of financial support for South Korea's defense.
We've seen skepticism about this financial arrangements before, right? Didn't Trump make some noise about that during his campaign?
He did. He questioned the fairness of the current burden-sharing agreement.
Right.
And if a new president decides to revisit those agreements, it could become a major point of contention, a golden opportunity for North Korea, China, and Russia to exploit.
So let's shift gears and talk about those regional players. What's their end game here? What are they hoping to gain from this chaos?
Well, North Korea is the wild card, as always. Kim Jong-un is a master at seizing these kinds of opportunities. Yeah. He's already shown he's willing to use provocations to get what he wants in this situation. It's practically gift-wrapped for him.
He could use it to test the waters, see how far he can push the U.S. and South Korea before they push back.
Exactly. He's got a whole arsenal at his disposal: missile tests, cyber attacks, military incursions, even nuclear threats. And let's not forget his track record. Remember, the missile launch right before the last U.S. election. It's a tactic he's used before, and it's one he's likely to use again.
So if you're the U.S. or South Korea, for that matter, what's the playbook here? How do you prevent Kim Jong-un from turning this situation into a full-blown crisis?
First and foremost, project strength and unity. Any sign of division or weakness will be like blood in the water to Kim Jong-un. They need to be prepared to respond quickly and decisively to any provocations. Deterrence is key.
But you can't just rattle sabers and hope for the best, right? You've got to keep those diplomatic channels open as well.
Absolutely. The ultimate goal is still a peaceful resolution on the Korean Peninsula. But it's a tough balancing act, especially with this added layer of complexity. It's like trying to defuse a bomb while juggling chainsaws.
Speaking of adding fuel to the fire, how are China and Russia likely to play this?
They're probably popping champagne corks in Beijing and Moscow right now. A distracted and divided South Korea. That's a dream come true for them. They'll be looking to capitalize on this to undermine U.S. influence in the region and advance their own strategic goals.
So what's on their agenda? What specific moves are they likely to make?
They could increase their economic and military support for North Korea, making it even harder to rein in Kim Jong-un. They could ramp up their efforts to sow discord between South Korea and Japan, driving a wedge between those two key U.S. allies. Or they could use their diplomatic muscle at the UN to block any resolutions aimed at punishing North Korea for provocations. Basically, they'll be looking for any opportunity to exploit this crisis and reshape the geopolitical landscape in their favor.
It sounds like South Korea's internal struggles are creating ripple effects far beyond their borders. It's not just about them anymore. It's about the whole regional balance of power.
Exactly. And the stakes couldn't be higher. The decisions made in the coming weeks and months will have a profound impact on the future of the region and the world.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground here, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. We need to delve deeper into the domestic situation in South Korea.
We need to understand what's driving this polarization within South Korean society and what it means for the country's future.
Let's hit pause here for a moment and pick up this thread in part 2 of our deep dive. And we're back, folks, continuing our deep dive into the political storm brewing in South Korea. Before we get back to the international implications, let's zoom in on what's happening within South Korea itself.
Yeah, it's crucial to understand the domestic factors that have brought them to this boiling point. It's not just about Yoon's policies. There are some deeper societal tensions at play here.
So what's at the root of all this unrest?
Well, one major factor is economic inequality. You see, despite South Korea's impressive economic growth, the gap between the rich and the poor is widening.
So even though the country's doing well overall, a lot of people are being left behind.
Exactly. And that's breeding resentment, frustration, especially among younger generations. They're struggling with outrageous housing costs, limited job opportunities, and a sense that the system is rigged against them.
And it sounds like that economic anxiety is coupled with a loss of trust in the political elite.
Absolutely. There's this perception that the government is more interested in serving the wealthy and powerful than the needs of ordinary people.
So you've got this volatile mix of economic anxiety, social unrest, and political disillusionment. No wonder things are coming to a head.
It's a tinderbox, and Yoon's actions have just thrown a match on it. His martial law declaration, even though it was reversed quickly, it tapped into those anxieties and fears.
Yeah, it's almost like a wake-up call for a lot of people. Suddenly, the instability they've been feeling in their own lives is reflected in the political system.
Right, and it's exposed the deep polarization within South Korean society. Yoon's supporters see him as a strong leader taking the necessary steps to protect the country, while his critics see him as an authoritarian figure undermining democratic norms.
So how's this playing out in terms of public opinion? Are people rallying behind Yoon, or is this backfiring on him?
It's a mixed bag, really. Yoon's approval ratings have taken a hit, and his political opponents are definitely using this to their advantage. They're painting him as unfit to lead, arguing that his actions have made things worse, and that he's more interested in consolidating power than actually solving the country's problems.
But I imagine his base is probably doubling down on their support.
They are. They see this as proof that he's willing to make tough decisions to protect the country from threats, both internal and external.
So we've got this deeply divided public president on shaky ground and a whole bunch of regional actors watching this unfold with a lot of interest. It feels like we're on a nice edge here. What are the potential scenarios that could play out?
Well, the best case scenario is that Yoon manages to weather this storm. He regains control of the narrative, things calm down domestically, and he reassures his allies that he's still a reliable partner. But honestly, that's a long shot at this point.
And the worst case scenario?
Things spiral out of control. The protests escalate, the economy tanks, and Yoon is either forced to resign or loses the next election. That would create a huge power vacuum, both domestically and internationally.
And then you've got North Korea, China, and Russia lurking in the background, waiting to take advantage of any weakness.
Exactly. They're watching this very closely, waiting for the right moment to pounce. A destabilized South Korea is in their strategic interests.
So let's talk about those regional players and their potential moves. We've touched on North Korea, but what about China? How are they likely to react to this turmoil?
China's in a tough spot. On one hand, they don't want to see complete chaos in South Korea. It's a major trading partner, and they don't want instability spilling over their borders. But on the other hand, a weakened South Korea, one that's distracted by its own problems and less aligned with the U.S., well, it's good for them.
So they're going to play it carefully, try to exert influence without pushing things over the edge?
Exactly. They'll likely use a mix of incentives and pressure, offering economic benefits to South Korea while also working to undermine its relationship with the U.S.
And how about Russia? What are their goals?
Russia's playing a longer game. They want to see the U.S. tied up in regional conflicts, distracted from what they see as their main adversary, NATO. A weakened U.S. presence in Asia gives them more room to operate in their own sphere of influence.
So this is less about South Korea specifically and more about weakening the U.S. globally?
Right. They'll be looking to amplify the chaos, the flames of discord, create as much trouble for the U.S. as they can.
It sounds like South Korea is caught in the middle of this geopolitical tug of war. It's not just about their own internal problems anymore. They've become a pawn in a much bigger game.
That's the reality, unfortunately. And it makes predicting what will happen next even more difficult.
Okay, let's bring it back to the U.S. for a minute. What are the potential implications for U.S. foreign policy, especially considering we're heading into a presidential election?
This throws a big wrench into U.S. strategy in the region. The Biden administration was counting on a strong, unified front with South Korea and Japan to counter China. But now that strategy is looking a lot less certain.
And with the election coming up, we could see a major shift in U.S. policy toward South Korea depending on who wins.
Absolutely. A new president might not be as committed to supporting South Korea, especially if they see Yoon's actions as hurting U.S. interests. They might be more open to making deals with China, even if it means compromising South Korea's security.
So the stakes for South Korea are incredibly high. They're facing internal turmoil, external pressure, and a potential shift in their most important alliance.
It's a make-or-break moment for them. The choices they make in the coming months will have huge consequences, not just for South Korea, but for the whole region.
This feels like a good point to pause and catch our breath. We've covered a lot, from domestic unrest to international maneuvering. But there's one more layer to this story that we need to explore.
We need to look at the long-term implications of this crisis for South Korea, the U.S., and the balance of power globally.
Stay with us for the final part of our deep dive, where we'll examine those broader ramifications and what they could mean for the future. And we're back for the final stretch of our deep dive into the South Korean situation. We've talked about the internal pressures, the external players, but now let's step back and look at the bigger picture.
Yeah, we need to consider the long-term fallout from all of this, not just for South Korea, but for the region and the U.S.
It really feels like this whole situation has exposed some serious cracks in the foundation of the international order.
It has.
Yeah.
We're seeing this resurgence of nationalism, authoritarianism, a willingness to challenge the norms that have shaped global relations for decades.
And this isn't happening in some far-off corner of the world. It's happening right here in our backyard.
It is. This crisis is a stark reminder that democracy is fragile. It's something that needs to be constantly defended and nurtured both domestically and internationally.
And it really underscores the importance of strong alliances. When you're facing challenges like this, it's vital to have partners you can rely on.
Absolutely. The U.S.-South Korea alliance has been this bedrock of stability in the region for decades. But it's clear it's facing some serious challenges right now.
So what are the potential long-term implications for the alliance? Is this just a bump in the road, or could it lead to a more fundamental shift in the relationship?
It's tough to say for certain, but I think this has definitely shaken things up. Yoon's actions have raised some eyebrows in Washington about his judgment, his commitment to democratic principles.
And I bet there are concerns about his willingness to work with the U.S., especially given his more independent approach to foreign policy.
There's also this growing sense that South Korea's interests might not always perfectly align with those of the U.S. They're dealing with a different set of challenges and pressures, and they might be less willing to just follow the U.S. lead.
So maybe the alliance needs to be recalibrated.
Possibly. Both sides may need to make adjustments to adapt to the changing dynamics in the region. They need a way to work together that acknowledges those shared interests, but also respects those differing perspectives.
And of course, the upcoming U.S. presidential election adds another layer of uncertainty to the mix.
Absolutely. Depending on who wins, we could see a pretty significant shift in U.S. policy towards South Korea and the whole Asia-Pacific region. A new administration might be less inclined to offer the same level of support for South Korea, especially if they view Yunnan's actions as damaging U.S. credibility.
So what does this mean for the future of the region? Is this crisis a sign of things to come, or is it an outlier?
It's probably a bit of both. This situation has exposed some vulnerabilities in the regional order. China's rise, Russia's assertiveness, North Korea's unpredictability. These are all forces that are making things more volatile and uncertain.
And the U.S. is going to have to figure out how to navigate this new landscape one where its traditional alliances are being tested and its leadership is being challenged.
Exactly. The old playbook might not cut it anymore. The U.S. needs to be more strategic, more adaptable, more willing to collaborate with a broader range of partners.
And it's not just about military power anymore. It's about economic influence, diplomacy, and cultural soft power.
It's about building relationships, fostering trust, showing that the U.S. is a reliable and responsible partner.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways for our listeners? What should they keep in mind as they follow this story?
The main thing is the situation in South Korea is far from settled. It's fluid, complex, and the ripple effects are going to continue to be felt for quite a while.
And this isn't just some faraway problem. It has real implications for the U.S., its place in the world.
The U.S. can't afford to sit back and watch. It needs to be actively engaging its allies, strengthening partnerships, finding new ways to address the challenges from China and Russia.
And it needs to do all this while grappling with its own internal divisions and political uncertainties.
It's a tall order for sure, but the stakes are high. The decisions made in the coming months will impact the Asia-Pacific region and the global balance of power for years to come.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground today. We've explored this political upheaval in South Korea, the potential damage to the U.S.-South Korea alliance. We've talked about North Korea, China, Russia, all watching this very closely. And we've considered how this could permanently shift the balance of power in East Asia. It's a lot to digest, but it's essential to stay informed and engaged as the situation continues to evolve. Things are changing fast, and we all need to pay attention. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring.